Harsh, there was a report of KPMG, our IT giant, and it was talking about the sports industry here in India, and it also talked about Top Scheme, which gives us a sponsorship to the tennis players, and it was mentioned that India's medal prospects at the Olympics, Divid Sharan and Rohan, even in this pandemic, a lot of Indian players have been supported. The counter question to that was that, do you think that the sponsorship should be given to players who are making transition from the junior to professional circuit? Because usually the sponsorships are spent on, medal prospects at this point of time, but is it a need to spend money on the transition of a junior development player? Is there a need to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. To develop your players to a high standard, you absolutely have to fund them. To expect individual families to come up with the funding for professional tennis is really, as I mentioned on a previous call too, is out of the reach of most families. So one of the things that is done in the US, and I find it interesting, is that they focus a lot of their funding and resources on that junior stage, when the players need that support, and particularly in that transition phase. So from 16, 17, 18, you're one of the top juniors, then you're going into the professional ranks. Those 3-4 years, as you start professional tennis, you need a lot of support until you can break into the top 100. So much of the emphasis, much of the resources and funding is provided at the junior level and right through the transition phase. And then once players break into the top level in the world, once they're top 50 or top 100, then they can start, self-sustaining and building their own teams and using those resources. So without that, without funding and support at the junior level and at the transition phase, I think it's extremely difficult, and that's one of the reasons we are seeing very few Indian players breaking in. We still have just cup 1 or 2, and so that's been the story since I was a junior. The last 20-25 years, really not much has changed, and I think one of the key reasons why India hasn't had more players in the top 100 is because there's been a lack of support, particularly in tennis, in that very difficult journey. And very expensive, by the way, to travel internationally and play 30-40 weeks a year and have a coach and have all of the support system. You're talking about a very big budget that you need. And unless the federation, unless the government, unless private entities really get behind it, it's very difficult for individual families to come up with that type of funding.
Yeah, great thoughts on that, Harsh. Rakesh, if I may come to you on that. There is a strong need of this ecosystem that's been talked about, and there is a question which has come about as well. Is there some branding or some viewership really important to actually make that transition for a junior player, because it's an expensive journey? Does a company like Stag or say Babele or the private concerns here in India, can they take up some player development initiatives? That's the question. Is it about the rankings, or is it about developing the players? Is there a need? Can actually a company actually come behind someone and say that we're going to support player development program? Is there a need for that, according to you?
Yeah, there's definitely a big need for that. What we can achieve, I think that is a big question. But having said that, if you consider table tennis, all the top Indian players, they have been sponsored by Stag at some point or the other. Manika Batra, when she was 6, we started sponsoring her at that time, and she was sponsored by us right till the time she became the Commonwealth champion. Of course, if you talk about Sharaf Kamal, in his inception stage, till he came to the world level, we were always sponsoring him. Whether it is Amal Raj, whether Neha Agarwal, the Olympian. We have been sponsoring each and every table tennis player which has had some kind of achievement in the last 30-40 years. So, we have been doing that. Now, tennis, to that extent, I think it's a very tricky situation, because, in tennis, if you're not in the top 50, it's in ATP, if you're not in the top 50, it's very difficult to sustain. You cannot have enough to travel. And the business of tennis in India is relatively very small. Very small in the sense that the entire business is about 70-80 crores, and it has the head, it has the Babala, it has each and every brand which you name. And for a player to play maybe 20 tournaments or 30 tournaments, 30 ATP tournaments in a year, I think he needs something like 4 to 5 crores. So I don't think so that a table tennis or a tennis brand can think of such kind of money. But yes, there are a lot of corporate sectors in India, the CSR funds which are there. Those are the things which which need to be spent on these players. Let them each develop maybe 2 players or 3 players whom they think that they can come to the international level. That is what needs to be done. I mean, expecting this from a Babla in India or a Head in India or a Wilson in India, that will be, I think, a very tough ask. But definitely the corporate players can come in.
Yeah, great thoughts on that. Harsh, if you would add on that, something on that. Yes.
Yeah, one aspect I wanted to touch on was also the impact of the pandemic, and particularly in India, the impact has been hard now 2 years in a row. And so last year, several months of lockdown, programs closed, and now again we're facing a very similar situation. Since April, most of the country has been in lockdown. This is now ongoing for several weeks and months, and the impact has been very hard on tennis programs that have had to be shut. It's very difficult to deliver tennis remotely. You can, yes, engage with your players, but how do you actually build your program around that? And a lot of programs are going through an extremely tough time. And some of the feedback I've also received from other coaches is, that it's difficult to keep the coaches, their teams. People are now moving on to to find different work. So I think the tennis industry, as Rakesh ji was saying, anyways, is quite small in the bigger picture, but also has been impacted very, very, in a tough way with the pandemic. And it's very concerning, to see how the programs and academies will survive through this, how coaches, those delivering the sport, will survive. And, in the US, we've been fortunate. Last year, the lockdowns weren't as hard. There's been a lot of government support. The USTA has done a phenomenal job in terms of the support they've provided to programs. And that continues to be even this year. The grants that they've come up with to help programs restart, to help with recovery efforts, to help with equipment costs, there's been a lot of support. And that's helped tennis programs to withstand, the impact of the pandemic. So all of this needs to be thought through. And of course, in our small way, Tennis City, and in partnership with MLTA and Roots, we are starting to launch some initiatives to support coaches. So recently, we launched the courses, the triphasic courses, offering to help coaches train and sort of gain the knowledge during this time. We are planning a few other initiatives. So these are the sorts of areas that I think the private public sector can come together, everyone doing their bit to support the industry during this time, and to try to get the industry stronger and coming back stronger too.